Good evening from the Defence and Security Circle of the National Liberal Club in London. My name's Noel Hadjimichael, and as Chair, may I welcome you from across the United Kingdom, NATO, our allies and our friends. Due to the large audience tonight, we are going to have your audio and video in mute mode, and that will assist us to maintain bandwidth strength. But we are committed to ensuring at least 30 minutes of Q&A, and we'll be asking you to keep your questions to 30 seconds so that we can get at least 15 or more questions answered. To have a question in the queue, please use the chat function and message myself, Noel Hadjimichael, to join that queue. The session is being recorded and you can access the edited version on the NLC's YouTube channel by this Friday, we believe. Two things that you may not know. If you are a civilian MOD employee or a uniformed member of the Armed Forces, membership of the National Liberal Club, you enjoy a 50% discount on that. And if you attend any of our talks and your membership application is forwarded to myself and through the Defence and Security Circle at the club, anyone, MOD, Armed Forces or any other status, will have their membership joining fee waived, which reduces the first year's fee. Importantly, may I introduce Lynne O'Donnell, our interviewer and interlocutor tonight. She's an acclaimed author and war reporter who has seen up close the challenges and the stresses of those serving, who will tonight interview Nicola Williams. Our speaker is herself an author, a lawyer, somebody who has served on the bench, but importantly also has been until recently the Complaints Ombudsman for the UK Armed Forces. I am sure we are all going to be in for a fascinating and fearless talk and Q&A session. Over to Lynne.
Thanks, Noel. Hi, Nicola, and welcome to everybody who's joined us this evening. The title of this evening's presentation is Cultural Change in the UK Armed Forces, which is just an enormous topic and far too big to cover in just an hour. But huge cultural shifts did coincide with Nicola's tenure as the service's Complaints Ombudsman. So, Nicola, let's start off with a description of your role. What's the job of the service's Complaints Ombudsman, and how do you think it changed under your leadership?
Well, good evening, Lynne, and good evening, everybody. I say good evening. It's evening in the UK. It may not be evening from other places because I know this has a broad international following. And I'm very glad, Lynne, just as a slight preamble, to say that you pointed out exactly what I was going to say, that cultural change in the armed forces is far too broad a topic to discuss in 1 hour. It may be something that might need to be revisited depending on the aspect. But the one thing that I can speak about with authority, although of course I have opinions about other things, but I can speak with authority about the attitude or the change, cultural change with regards to service complaints, both complainants and complaints within the armed forces, and whether or not that has changed. And I think your first question, and correct me if in my preamble that I've forgotten what it is, I think you asked me about my term as the Ombudsman, and I suppose what we did and what's the job, our leadership. Yeah. Okay. Well, I am the first ever Ombudsman in UK Defence, but not the first ever person with responsibility for civilian oversight. Civilian oversight really came in 2008. Very Cliff Notes version for those who don't know, although I know many people on this call probably already do. In 2008, as a direct result, although long time coming, with what happened at Deep Cut, where 4 young people serving had taken their own lives, there was ultimately the Service Complaints Commission that was set up as an independent alternative point of contact for armed forces personnel to make a complaint, and also something that stands out with the services. So that was fine as far as it went, but certainly by the time of my appointment, the decision had already been taken that the powers did not go far enough. Hence, changing it from an ombudsman, from a commissioner to an ombudsman, and extending the powers of the ombudsman. I was the last commissioner for a year in 2015, and then from 2016, I was the ombudsman. And the main change in my powers is that I retain the powers of the old commissioner, but I also have additional powers to review admissibility decisions made by the services. If, for example, they felt that something wasn't worthy of being deemed a complaint, and the complainant wanted to come to our office for me to review that, I had the power to do that. And also I had the power to investigate with my own investigators allegations of undue delay, maladministration, and what we call substance matters, which is basically the whole complaint at the end. But that would have to happen once the internal process had been exhausted.
Well, what challenges did you face, Nicola? And what goals did you have? What barriers did you come up against? Give us an idea of what you got yourself into.
Well, I didn't really know what I got myself into, you know, full disclosure. All I knew about the armed forces was what I'd read in the newspaper. And at the time, the reputation of the armed forces in general was actually quite high. And I still think it is quite high externally as far as members of the public feel about the armed forces. But they certainly had some issues that really needed to be brought into the 21st century in terms of dealing with service complaints. So my initial challenges, well, my first big challenge was the pre-appointment hearing for my role. Because I was the first ombudsman, I had a pre-appointment hearing before the House of Commons Defence Committee, so I had to get through that. But once I was in post, there was a wariness amongst some quarters about what I was actually going to do. At its extreme, people actually thought, believe it or not, that I was going to tell armed forces personnel they didn't have to fight, they could go on strike, they could put their weapons down, which of course I was never going to suggest that. Secondly, people thought that I was going to come in as a civilian and just tear everything up and completely upend everything that the armed forces hold dear. And I absolutely would not have done that. And in any event, there are lots of things that I personally respect and admire about the armed forces, and I think they should retain. But one thing that needed looking at very differently was how they treated their people with regards to service complaints. So if a serviceman or servicewoman felt that they had been wronged in their service life, they could come to our office, and that was the bit that needed to change. Now, in terms of the goals that I had a number of goals, but I suppose my top 5, knowing that I only had a 5-year tenure, in no particular order, it was to, I suppose probably the first one, having said there was no particular order. The first one was to make sure that the decisions that I made and the reports that I and my office sent out were high quality professional decisions that could withstand challenge by way of judicial review. And one of the things I'm proudest of is that throughout my entire tenure as Ombudsman, I have never had a decision from my office overturned by way of judicial review. And not many ombudsmen can say that. So it is something that I'm very proud of. I also wanted to have all our recommendations complied with. I wanted to raise the profile of the office so that service personnel would know about the office from us, not from some second or third hand hearsay, which would have painted us in a bad light. And as a result, myself and my team would go out and about, both throughout the nations of the United Kingdom and abroad, to meet people and tell them what the office was about. I wanted to improve our staff morale internally, because if you're dealing with complaints day in, day out for years, that is very, very wearing. And mental health is an issue for the armed forces. It's an issue for my staff as well. And I think finally, what I wanted to have, but I don't have, and I hope at some point this will come, is I wanted the Ombudsman to have the power to do their own investigations, own initiative or own motion investigations.
Mm-hmm. Well, your 2015 report says you weren't able to provide assurance that the complaint system was working efficiently, effectively, and fairly. Why was that, Nicola? And is it a different story now?
Well, you know, I'm known throughout the services for my polite candor. So here's some candor coming up here. I didn't judge it to be efficient, effective, and fair, which was a metric that I inherited. It wasn't one that I started. It was one that the previous commissioner, Dr. Atkins, had been working towards, and it was one that I inherited. But it wasn't. I didn't judge it to be efficient, effective, and fair in 2015 because it wasn't. That's broadly what it was. They were taking back in 2015, and I'm going to compare it to what it was at the time when my term came to an end. In 2015, they were taking far too long. By they, I mean the services, tri-service, were taking far too long to resolve complaints. Some complaints were in the process of being resolved for more than 7 years, which is absolutely outrageous. None of the services had resolved 90% of cases within 24 weeks. And in fact, tri-service, the average was 47%. There was a widespread reluctance in 2015 to come forward and make a complaint. Women in particular were putting up with a lot of conduct that would be deemed unacceptable in any other method of employment or walk of life without complaining. And the same could be said for junior ranks as well. And in fact, with regards to junior ranks, there were officers who would bristle at the suggestion that there was any problem with the people within their command because they hadn't told them, and they weren't telling them because they felt that their life wouldn't be worth living if they did. Now compare it to when my term ended at the end of last year. Sadly, it hasn't really changed that much. There has been progress, and it would be churlish of me not to say that. There has been progress year on year, but sadly, overall, I still adjudged in the last report that I signed off as commissioner, I still adjudged the system to be inefficient, ineffective, and unfair. It's still taking too long to resolve matters. They are still not hitting the 90% within 24-week target, although that has improved, or some services have improved it. And the widespread reluctance to complain, that has improved, and the confidence in my office has improved. You will find that the average service person would say that they are confident in my office or my former office, but they didn't have that level of confidence within their own service to resolve matters. And that isn't a matter of pride beyond a certain point for my office, because the system, both halves have to work. If one half works and the other one doesn't, then the whole system fails.
Can you describe the progression of complaints? Where do they mostly come from? Are we talking about the low ranks, NCOs, women, as you referred to, Black and minority ethnic personnel? Is there a consistency to the complaints from these demographics? I mean, these are the areas that we've seen huge cultural shift in over the last few years. As I said before, it coincided with your tenure. So let's look at the progression of complaints, where they come from, and then the impact of these enormous global cultural movements.
Well, that's a really interesting question. I might have to break it down a little bit, but it is absolutely very interesting, because 2020 was a very unusual year with the pandemic, and after the killing of George Floyd, the I suppose worldwide outrage about that, and the Black Lives Matter movement, and all of that impacted everything, not just the armed forces. In terms of complaints that come directly to our office, because there are two ways that we can get complaints. They could either go through the internal process within the service and then come to us if they're unhappy, or they can come to us first. We would then encourage them, whoever the person is, to exhaust their internal process, and then if they're still unhappy, they can come to us. So there are a number of complaints that we would never hear about. If someone complains within the army, for example, and their complaint starts and ends in the army, and they're happy with that, then we would never hear about that. But in terms of the ones that we actually hear about, surprisingly to me, the biggest number of applications, 50% of all of the applications to our office for us to look at matters, were from NCOs and warrant officers. Now, they're very interesting because they are both most likely to be complained about and also most likely to make a complaint. So that's sort of the meat in the sandwich, if you like. then after them, junior ranks, and then officers. In terms of women and ethnic minority personnel, women tri-service were 12% of the overall armed forces cohort, but they make up, as of the annual report 2019, which came out in May of last year, 12% of the total number of armed forces personnel, but 23% of the admissible complaints. And admissible is interesting because it means that possibly more people were complaining, but we didn't deem it admissible because of the legislation. And with regards to Black and minority ethnic personnel, they make up 8% of the tri-service personnel, but 13% of the complaints. What is also interesting is what people complain about. The thing that people complain about the most is actually not bullying, harassment, and discrimination, which I think would surprise most people and actually surprised me before I became the Ombudsman. But it's actually around career management. If people feel that they are not being promoted, or that their SJARs and OJARs, the reports that they have to have both mid-year and annually, aren't being done properly because it's on that basis that you get a promotion or not. So most of the complaints are around that. But bullying, harassment, and discrimination is still a matter about which people complain. It has reduced since I've been in post. It's reduced by about 8 to 10 percentage points. And as of my last annual report, it was 25% of our complaints. But it had come down from between 33 to 35%. So that is still unreasonably high. So that I hope gives you a reflection of the kinds of complaints. Now, whether or not the pandemic or the Black Lives Matter protests have had an effect on matters, I think remains to be seen. We're only at the beginning. All of this happened last year. The pandemic really, in terms of how it affected the UK, was March of last year. The Black Lives Matter protest was really from the summer of last year. So it's not really a full year as yet. But with the straws in the wind and my experience of these things, I think the pandemic will mean that there are people at home who possibly would not have complained about something, but they had time to think about it, and then they're going to make a complaint. But also there are people who, for example, someone from the Navy, for example, might have been working from home, as they would have been entitled to do. They might have been ordered to come back into Naval HQ or wherever they were based to work in the office. They might feel that they didn't want to do that because of caring responsibilities or concerns about the coronavirus, but felt compelled to do so, and they didn't want to do that. They may well make a complaint about that. Because complaints take a long time to go through the system, I think it won't be until probably mid this year that we see what the impacts of those things have been. With regards to Black Lives Matter, I think that has really raised the whole issue about diversity, put a whole new light on it, not just for the services, but also for civilians within the MOD and also other professions as well.
I guess there's a lot of nitty-gritty in there, isn't there? Whether or not you can separate out concerns about career management from discrimination. It seems there's complexities built into that.
I absolutely agree. And I'm actually glad that you pointed that out. I think quite often, and I myself tend to fall into that, which is a slightly lazy way of phrasing. Quite often complaints, broadly speaking, are categorized into terms and conditions of service, which would be about career management, pay and pensions, accommodation, which generates a lot of complaints actually, for example, or bullying, harassment and discrimination. But they're not two discrete entities. Somebody might not be promoted because someone, for example, a servicewoman might not be promoted because somebody within her reporting chain is discriminating against her on the basis of her gender, for example. So sometimes you can use them as discrete entities, but life isn't that neat, and neither are service complaints.
No, indeed. Well, have you noticed that the attitude at the top of the services has changed towards complaints and those who complain? How do the armed forces respond to people who make complaints? Do they welcome complaints as a way of improving their own performance, or is this just something that they have to deal with? Is this where the culture needs to change?
Well, during my tenure, I can certainly say that All right, let me put it this way. In 2008, which is when the first independent civilian oversight over service complaints started, there was tremendous resistance to that. And anyone who wants to deny that, frankly, is laboring under misapprehension. I was going to say lying to themselves, but laboring under misapprehension. Certainly by the time I was in role, it was an idea whose time had come. There was still pockets of concern. I certainly remember meeting previous service chiefs who now sit in the Lords, and they had some concerns which I hope that I was able to relay. But certainly, and I think they thought I was going to be this wild maverick, so that was also their concern. But in terms of the attitudes, I think it has shifted, and the shifting has taken place from the top. For example, Sir Nick Carter, who is now the Chief of the General Staff, the Chief of Defence Staff, when he was the Chief of the General Staff, when he was the head of the army, he said, and I quote, "It's cool to complain." And so certainly at the top, and I do believe that's a view that's shared by other service chiefs, they realize that there is some benefit from that, because if people complain, it means A, they won't leave, and there is a recruitment issue with regards to the armed forces, and B, you don't get a sort of festering resentment which just spreads like a cancer. But having said that, that's the tone from the top. If you ask the junior ranks, I've often told them, well, this is what he said. And they said, well, yeah, he would say that, but we know what would happen if we made a complaint. So it hasn't really trickled down. And there is a permafrost, which is usually, it has to be said, at the sort of warrant officer NCO level, where they tend to be very resistant to people making complaints. So that, I think, it's not bad, but could be better. One thing that has changed, I think, very, very positively, and I say this because people don't complain about this, but it is a feature of a lot of the complaints that we get, is around mental health. Because a lot of the complainants that come to us have issues with mental health. Some have had that before and has been exacerbated by the complaints process, particularly if it's been lengthy. And some have been in the complaints process for so long that has actually tipped the balance of their mental health. So I think the attitudes to mental health has changed, and the attitudes to complaints have changed, but it's like turning around the Queen Mary. I mean, the Ombudsman's office has only been going for 5 years. The youngest of the services, which is the RAF, has been going for over 100 years. So you can see we've got a lot of work to do.
Yes, indeed. Well, do you think that the new Armed Services Bill that's currently wending its way towards law is going to make any difference? And in what way to the way, people's lives are managed while they're in the services and veterans?
Well, I don't know. I think one way, because I know it's just had its second reading on Monday, and a lot can happen between the second reading of a bill and when it actually becomes law. One thing that I think is a very positive change, that a sort of positive thing that is coming out of the new Armed Forces Bill, is a recommendation for, if you like, a Service Police Complaints Ombudsman, or Complaints Commission, I can't remember, but it's to do with complaints involving service police. It is something that I had, I suppose, a particular professional interest in, because I was, for civilian police, I was an IPCC commissioner, and so it's something that I was very aware of. And at one point, there was a thought about my office, taking that work on, and I'd always said, yes, we'll take it on if you resource us adequately to do it, but we're just about resourced to do the work that we have. So I think that is a positive change. The rest we have to wait and see. Something that I don't think has come out of the bill, but changes that I know that are being made by the MOD with regards to service complaints, is that after 5 years effectively of me saying that the service complaints process is still not, or the services within the service complaints process, it's still not efficient, effective and fair. They are actually looking at a sort of root and branch look at the system overall, whether it can be improved. And I think, after 5 years, it's always a good time to look at something afresh. And so we wait to see what will happen with regards to that. Until the issue of delay is resolved, there will always be some fundamental fissures within the service complaints process.
Yeah. Before we move to questions, Nicola, a couple of things for you personally. What's coming next? And can you tell us about your book? Your 1997 book, Without Prejudice, is about to have a new lease on life. Now, there's a comeback and a half. Can you tell us something about that?
Yes, it is. And so actually that's part of the what's coming next. What's coming next is a mixture of things for me, but effectively summed up as writing. I've just completed the final draft of a second book. So writing, certainly. I sit part-time as a Crown Court judge. I'm a Crown Court recorder. I've been doing that for over 10 years, and I will carry on doing that. In fact, the courts were largely shut during the pandemic, and I had my first trial at the end of January, so they're opening back up. Courts in COVID are very interesting, I think. And generally, I suppose, a portfolio career. I'm the chair of a complaints panel for the Portman Group as well. In terms of my book, lots of serendipity around this book, both the first time it came out and the second time. But just for brevity, I'll just talk about the second time. I'd written that book, and I'd always meant to write another one, but I had a busy private practice and never got around to it. And then probably about February last year, I went with a friend to go to a very, very fancy Magic Circle law firm, had 4 writers, Louise Doughty, Bernadine Evaristo, and forgive me, Mallory Blackman and Diana Evans, I think. And they were all reading from their books. Very nice. These officers are amazing. And Bernadine sort of recognized me. We're not like close friends. I know who she is, but I hadn't seen her for about 15, 20 years. And she recognized me and she said, "You wrote that book, didn't you?" And I said, "Yes, I did." And she said, "What happened? Did you write another one?" And I looked a bit shamefaced and said, "No, I wish I had done, but I didn't." And she said, "No, you should have done. It was really good." And that was February of last year. And then in the summer of last year, I get someone calling me for an unknown number. Normally I don't answer those, but it was quite persistent. And I said, "All right." I answered not very graciously. What? And they turned out to be Bernadine's editor from Penguin, and she had chosen my book and 5 others to bring to light again books that she felt didn't get the acclaim that they needed, that they should have got the first time around. And she has been very instrumental in that, so I owe her a great debt for that. Yes, and I hope you buy it. It's about my experiences as well. It's not about my experiences. It's not an autobiography. I'm waiting another 10 years before I write that. But it is based on my experiences as a barrister. And it's one of those dinner party questions lawyers always get answered. How can you represent someone that you know is guilty? So it's kind of based on that.
Well, terrific. A new lease on life. I think it's time that we go to some questions. The first question I'm going to first questioner, excuse me, I'm going to call upon is Baroness Judith Jolly. And Baroness, as for everybody, could you please keep your question brief so we can squeeze in as many as possible? Please go ahead. Is Baroness there? Can't hear Baroness. Baroness Judith Jolly.
I know Judith. It would be lovely to get her question. If we can hear her, she's probably on mute.
Oh, Baroness, please unmute.
I don't think I am now.
Yes,
no, there you
hear you.
Please go ahead. Lovely. Yeah.
I mean, where's the 5 years gone? But if your term was a year longer, is there anything more you would like to have done?
Yes, if I had this is part of my, if you like, my wish list. The one thing I would have liked to have done, and I really hope it does come at some point for the Ombudsman, because this is a relay race. You know, I've done my 5 years, but, you know, it's going to take 2 or 3 Ombudsmen before we actually get to the final finish line or get to the goal. I would want to have the power to do own initiative or own motion investigations, and which would mean that, God forbid we ever get anything like Deep Cut happening again, but that I would be able to go in with my own investigators and take over the scene and deal with it right from the beginning. I think that would instill a lot more trust and confidence in the process, and that's one thing I would like. And the other thing, I think, but it's more a personal thing for the office needs both a deputy ombudsman and a part-time lawyer, at least. I cannot tell you, I know it sounds like I'm playing the world's smallest violin, but honestly, doing that job, it was a great joy and a great honor, but it was incredibly challenging because I didn't have that deputy ombudsman support. I did have other senior people in the office, but not that. But in terms of service personnel, it would be that. And also, once we can get out and about, going out and doing more visits, because every single time I have done a visit, both within the UK and abroad, people have been incredibly appreciative of it.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Nice to see you again.
Thank you.
Yes, yes.
Our next questioner is Nora Hudson. Please unmute yourself and ask away. Nora? Where's Nora? Nothing from Nora. All right, well, let's move on and come back to Nora. Have we found you, Nora?
Yeah, sorry, it just wasn't unmuting. I beg your pardon. No,
Here we go. Welcome. Please ask.
thank you. Yes, so you said that complaints took far too long to resolve, and that did seem to continue a little bit. And this is a very common problem in many institutions. Can you put your finger on what was the reason for the length of time complaints were taking to be resolved? Was it a lack of desire to deal with it? Was it difficulty in getting information from the right relevant parties? Was it bureaucracy or what? Do you know?
Well, candid moment coming up here. I don't care what it is, but it was inexcusable. It just is. Not all complaints had taken 5, 6, 7 years to resolve, but I personally am aware of a complaint that took nearly 10 years, nose to tail, to resolve. That is absolutely outrageous. I sit as a judge on some pretty serious things, and I can sentence someone for a serious GBH and they can go to jail and come back out, and that complaint would still be going through the system. Now, I hear what you say, that there is delay in lots of other areas, but there is excessive delay within the armed forces with regards to service complaints. Why that is, I mean, some complaints take a longer time to resolve than others. Usually bullying, harassment and discrimination complaints do take longer than terms and conditions of service or career management. Those matters, the BHD matters, I believe should be dealt with by a separate body. For example, the Defence Authority that was proposed by Sir Michael Wixton, Chief of the Air Staff, in his report into inappropriate behaviours. And I would strongly urge the MOD, to the extent that they would listen to me now, I would strongly urge them to do that. It's a separate body outside the services that can deal with those matters and would stop the kind of sclerotic nature of the system as it is. But really, there is no excuse for a matter taking years to resolve. Months, yes. Years, no. There are not many private sector organisations that can't resolve a complaint within 6 months. And I think even the services themselves would admit that.
Thank you very much, Nora. Janet Berridge, come on in for your question. Make sure you're unmuted.
Good evening, and thank you very much for that very, very interesting, detailed explanation of what you did in 5 years. It's absolutely fascinating. You've mentioned briefly that you didn't have a deputy and you have your investigators, but how large was your staff? How many people did you have? And did you feel that you had all the resources that you needed? And was it easy to get more if you did need more staff?
Well, thank you for that. That's a really useful question, because I think a lot of people think that I have endless pots of money and a massive staff. First of all, when I started as the commissioner, I had a staff of a grand total, bearing in mind that we're dealing with complaints from the armed forces wherever they're based in the world, all of them, grand total of 12 staff. That was when I started. It went up to, yes, I know, and that was everybody. That was everybody. It went up to 23, and then I think up to 25, but it's never been more than 25 staff. Now, of that, 10 or so were investigators, and then at full complement, it should be 10 investigators, head of investigations, and chief of operations, at full complement. We have only ever, in the entire time that I've been ombudsman, we have only ever been at full complement for 3 months of the 5 years that I was ombudsman. So when people, and with that, and this is why I feel so strongly about delay, despite that, although we have had a backlog, and particularly one point in my midterm where we went down from 10 investigators to 4 investigators, No, chief of operations, no head of investigations. 4 investigators I was personally managing, as well as being the ombudsman. Despite that, even though we had a backlog, our backlog was 150 to 160 cases. At the time that I left, our backlog was 27. So we got that down. And our staff numbers never went higher than that 10 investigators, and quite often wasn't even at 10. This is why when I make such trenchant views about delay within the services, I know what I'm talking about. And I know things can be done better and different. We've become experts at doing more with less. But you can do more with more. That's really what we want to get to.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Brian Williams, you are our next questioner. Make sure you're unmuted.
Good morning, all. So my question is, you mentioned briefly, Nicola, in your presentation that senior flag rank had said it's cool to complain.
Yes.
But I'm just wondering what's being done about the perception at, say, the senior NCO and the warrant officer rank, that the view to, if you have a complaint is, or the solution to it is a spoonful of concrete in your coffee and go and deal with it. It's not something you...
I've never heard that one. That's interesting.
Well, I removed the expletive that I heard from one warrant officer during my officer training.
I've heard a lot of expletives in this job, and I was a criminal barrister, so I've heard a lot of expletives. So, but I'm glad you're sparing everybody else's delicate ears.
Yes.
So
it's interesting. Yeah, I was just going to say, it's not something unique to the MOD. It's unique to most armed forces across the globe.
Yes. I'm sorry. I think the question that you asked me is, what can you do if the senior ranks are saying it's cool to complain, but there's a dissonance or a disconnect with the warrant officer ranks? What can be done with that? Well, when I used to do my force visits, I always had a particular, not routine, because that makes it sound quite dull and boring, but you know, I would always separate the ranks, junior ranks, NCOs and warrant officers, and then officers, and speak to them separately. And with the NCOs, I'd usually get a lot of very forbidding body language, a lot of crossed arms and legs akimbo and quite sort of threatening body language. But it didn't bother me. Like I say, I've been a criminal barrister and I've stared down worse than that. So that didn't really concern me. I think they didn't realize that, I think they felt quite defensive, and they didn't realize that a lot of the complaints that we were seeing had actually come from that cohort. Once I'd explained that to them, and that it's not a Winchester charter, it's not somebody who's too weak and they can't cut it and they should just get out. Again, deleting the expletives that they would add to that. People have a right to complain. They have a right to make a legitimate complaint. And I've always said, because I'm actually known for my candor throughout the services, they'll tell you that. I've always said that, you know, we in my office have neither the personnel, the resources, nor the inclination to entertain a bogus complaint. So anyone can make a complaint, but as soon as we realize there's no foundation to that, and particularly if we believe that it is a vexatious complaint, then we would give that the short shrift that it deserves. But you're entitled to make a complaint, and it is not a sign of weakness to do that. I hope that the view of complaints would actually shift in the way that the view of mental illness or a mental health episode or depression has actually become much more acceptable to talk about within the services. And I really hope that that will shift. The one thing that would shift it is if a senior officer, particularly if it was a general officer, actually made a complaint, then that would really shift the perception. But it's not that they don't have things to complain about, but I've never, no, forgive me. I've had 1-star and above officers. I've had 2 complaints, but I'm sure there are many more. I think, and you know, the nature of my work is that I don't go around telling people that. I think if more people knew about that, and more warrant officers knew that they were in fact the people that would complain the most, I think their attitude would shift. But the cultural change has to be that it is not a weakness to complain. It takes a lot of courage to complain. And in fact, I had a sign up in my office left for me by Dr. Atkins, which is sometimes it takes more courage to pick up a pen than pick up a rifle. And it really does.
Yes, indeed. Thanks for your question, Brian. Our next questioner is Manish Tile, but I think, Manish, you may be having some audio problems, and Noel's going to ask your question for you. Am I right?
Thank you very much, Lynn. Yes, I'm asking the question on behalf of Manish Tayal, who is also on the front line for the Royal Navy with the health crisis. So he's trying to juggle two very important responsibilities. His question to Nicola is, you've noted that women and ethnic minorities are overrepresented in complaint submission. Do you have any insight into the reasons for this? And specifically, if personnel are too often put off from complaining, is that more or less an issue for both women and ethnic minorities?
Well, I'd like to preface this by saying that I get a wide range of complaints, and but many of those are from women and from ethnic minorities. And I always like to preface that because I think, as quiet as it's kept, there might be some people that might think that because I'm a Black woman that somehow I'm preferring or giving an extra weight to these complaints. I'm just talking about what I see. Why are there more complaints? Because more things happen to those two cohorts that they could complain about. What I have seen, though, is that people put up with a lot. That's armed forces across the board, for whom I have the utmost respect. So I don't want people to misconstrue anything that I've said. I have the utmost respect for the armed forces, I really do. But in terms of the bad apples within them, they can cause a lot of damage. And you would find that the average servicewoman or ethnic minority serviceman or woman would actually put up with an awful lot before there's the last straw that breaks the camel's back. And in fact, I can think of one case which I don't want to the extent that I can talk about it, I want to keep it sort of anonymous. It was somebody who had wanted nothing else than to join the service, and had been a cadet and then had gone in as a regular and then had come out had been a reservist and had at least 25 years in. And for a good portion of that time, he had to deal with racial abuse. But the last straw for him was he was Black and his wife was white, and she turned up and she was racially abused because she was married to him. That was the thing that made him make a complaint. Nothing that had happened to him, as bad as it was, had made him make that complaint, but the last straw was that. So there are things that people go through. You don't know what it is that will tip the balance. Some people just want to keep their head down, and I don't blame them for that. Some people wait and they think, well, I've only got 6 months of this posting, I'm going somewhere else, and then it will be different. But there certainly are issues that need to be looked at. I will say, though, that the MOD, and particularly because of the events of this year, but also generally, are really taking a much more critical eye and a much more incisive and gripping manner with regards to things to do with diversity, and also how they're reflected in service complaints. But there's a long way to go. There's still a number of people, for everyone that makes a complaint, and this is a really good point to make, the vast majority of people don't. The vast majority of people who have a matter about which they could legitimately complain do not make a complaint about it. A staggeringly high number, well over 90%. So that's where we are with that.
Thanks, Nicola. Next up, Rupert Morris, our esteemed chairman. Over to you. Do unmute, won't you?
I have. I hope so. Nicola, I want to ask you about chaplaincy and pastoral care, because you would hope that if chaplaincy and pastoral care do a good job, people would go to them first if they've got a problem before it becomes a complaint. What have your dealings been with chaplaincy and pastoral care in the armed forces, and how effective do you think they are?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question, Rupert, and it's lovely to see you as well. I think that I'm a huge believer in it, because often my average visit, when I would do it, I would meet, as I've said, the different ranks split out separately so they could be candid in what they're saying. But I would always meet the welfare arm, which would include pastoral care and chaplaincy, because quite often people, if they want to make a complaint, that's where they're going first. And it could be anything. They hear, someone might be homesick, which isn't a matter about which you can make a complaint, but they might have a legitimate complaint, but they don't want to put it within the complaint system because they're worried about any repercussions that might come from that. And it has been known that there have been repercussions. that have come from people making a complaint. So they're really good as a funnel to get information from. And when I've gone to do visits, quite often what they would tell me, anonymously of course, what they would tell me about in terms of the matters that come before them really reflect the kind of matters that I see as well. So, but they're often the first port of call for people. So I think they provide an invaluable resource. And I've had the honor of actually attending the chaplains conference on more than one occasion actually, and speaking at one. So I think they do provide a tremendous resource.
Terrific, thank you. Christopher Samuel, you're our next questioner. Christopher. Where's Christopher? No, Christopher, let's move on then. Claire Main, are you there? Oh no, there's Christopher. Hello there. Can you unmute and ask your question, please?
Trying to, oh, there we go.
We've got you. Go ahead.
Thank you. I had two questions. What is the condition, Nicola, when you won't be needed anymore? And the second one is, do you get questions internally within the service, the different terms and conditions which individual forces have to put up with? For example, harmony rules in the Royal Navy are much longer. You have to be away than the RAF, for example. But there are other anomalies within the services which is that the sort of question that you get?
Well, Christopher, if I could take your first question first, will there ever be a time when there won't be a need for an ombudsman? No, there'll always be a need for an ombudsman. But what I hope to see is that there will be if you like, an arc where people have an arc that will actually reflect what I've seen within my term anyway, that people complained a lot at the beginning, and then it started to level off. It dropped and then started to level off. In 2015, the last year as commissioner, we received something like 480 complaints to my office. In the first year as the ombudsman, we received 980 complaints. And the second year we received over 1,000 complaints. So that means that, you know, there's a big take up and then it sort of levels off. But there'll always be a need for an ombudsman. That is not a bad thing. There should always be an independent body that people can come and make a legitimate complaint to. Now, in terms of what might appear to be anomalies or between the different services about what might be the same issue, each of the services will happily tell you, and I'm sure you know this, that they have their own unique way of doing things and they don't like to be compared against each other. And so I would be told anecdotally about some of these things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it can found a complaint. If you join a service that has different rules to another service, that is the service that you've joined. So, but I could always make recommendations, what I call ancillary recommendations, or matters about changing policy or changing things, which are the recommendations that come up in my annual report. I've not made a recommendation about that, but I don't know whether that's answered your question. I think it has. Yes.
I think yes, indeed. Thanks, Nicola. Our next questioner is Claire Main. Come on in, Claire, and unmute and ask your question, please, of Nicola. Claire, are you there? Oh, here we go.
Oh, Claire.
I'm sorry, Claire, we can't hear you. Let's see if we can clear that up and go to Subu Laganathan. Are you there, Subu? Why don't you step in here while we sort out Claire's audio problems?
Sorry, are you able to hear me now?
Oh yes, that's better. Hello.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes.
Sorry about that. Okay. So all eyes are on the US at the moment with their LGBTQI plus policies. Mm-hmm. In the past decade or so, a decade ago or so, the UK lifted its ban on the recruitment of serving personnel who identify as LGBTQI+. In the news recently, there have been a number of transgender people who have been killed, have had their life extinguished. What I would like to know is, will the UK, the armed forces, continue to lead by example with their inclusion policies?
Well, that's a wonderful question, both detailed and open at the same time. It's a very good question. I believe they will. You, and I'm sure everyone else in this call knows that there are already transgender personnel that are serving within the UK Armed Forces. I believe that the UK's position was different to the US position on, and one would say more progressive than the US position on this. And I have absolutely no reason to believe that will change. It's interesting though, I have never received a complaint. We were talking about difference in terms of gender and ethnicity. I have only received one complaint from someone who felt that they were being discriminated on the basis of their sexuality. And I've yet to receive a complaint from a transgender serving person, but that may just be because the numbers aren't there as yet. And I hope that that won't happen. It's like, I don't know why this is making me think of it. I know why it's making me think of it. Women on the front line, colloquially speaking, it's not the proper way, but that's what it's called, because women have always been on the front line. If you're a medic, you're on the front line, but you know, women in infantry, for example. I believe the first woman that was in a frontline position as an infanteer was actually a trans woman. So I think, so it'll be interesting to see what will happen if, and there has been no issue with regards to that, but the issue about women in ground close combat, I think as the numbers increase, we may get complaints around that. But in terms of LGBTQIA+, I think the UK position is a good one.
Good news. Over to you, Sabu. We almost got you a little while ago. Are you there? And can you unmute and ask Nicola your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Here we go.
Fascinating discussion. I come from the world of finance, which has had a similar struggle over the last.
Sorry, could you speak up a little bit, please?
Sure. Can you hear me better now?
That's better. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, apologies. I come from the world of finance, where we've had a similar struggle with looking at diversity and cultural issues over the last 25 years. And my question was around whether the availability of data and new quantitative methods, has that increased transparency around identifying some of these underlying issues, and has that increased or decreased the possibility of more diverse leaders and possibly a quantifiable decrease in such complaints and better diversity and inclusion?
Well, in terms of diverse leadership, during my time as the Ombudsman, I was the most senior person. By the time I left, I was the most senior person of colour in UK Defence. And there was quite a yawning gap underneath. And so it's a little bit concerning. There was, I've forgotten her name, but DG Finance was also a woman of colour, and she'd left before I did. So, you know, there are some issues with regards to diversity at the top, both in the civil service and also in each of the armed forces, because in terms of, although their female personnel are getting increasingly better represented, although starting from a low base, you're seeing the numbers increase, particularly in the RAF, it has to be said. In terms of ethnic diversity, no, there's a long way to go with that. Increased leadership at the top may or may not make a difference. It all depends. In fact, I'm inclined to say, surprisingly, I don't think it will make a fundamental difference. The thing that makes a fundamental difference is cultural change. That's the thing that makes a fundamental difference. If the culture changes, then everything else flows naturally from that. In terms of data and collecting data and being able to make a deeper, a more granular analysis with better data. If you spoke to my former stats officer, that was the one thing he complained about with our office. He felt that if we had the requisite equipment, we could do a much better data analysis. We don't have that. So maybe going back to Baroness Jolly's point, that might be on my wish list as well. Something in order to give us the data to support what we actually see or hear anecdotally, but the data to support it.
Thanks, Nicola. Val Stansfield, I beg your pardon. Can you unmute yourself and ask away?
Oh, hi, Nicola. Good to see you.
Hello, Val. Lovely to see you as well.
Hi. I was reflecting back on your comments about mental health and was wondering whether the efforts of people like Prince Harry, a number of sports people, and Alistair Campbell being open about their own mental health issues had made it okay for service members to raise their mental health issues.
I'm so glad you asked me that question because it is absolutely on point. Sir Patrick Saunders, who's a 3-star general, he posted last Thursday, it's on Twitter, I don't know where else it is, and many thanks to Lynne for drawing it to my attention. He actually posted a short video talking about his own mental health challenge. And I know Patrick, I know him very well. And I would have assumed, because if you don't get to be a general unless you've seen some pretty awful things, I would have assumed that he might have had some issues, but he actually spoke about it and spoke about it in a very open way. And I really think that is going to encourage people to talk about their issues. And I genuinely think he probably helped save a life by doing that. And if I see him, I will tell him that. In terms of in fact, I have told him that. I messaged him to tell him that today. In terms of mental health, though, I think I'm so happy to see a real change in attitude, not just in the armed forces, but if I think about my other career as a barrister, if you were a barrister and you had a mental health issue, you would never tell anybody. You just wouldn't do it. It was seen as career ending. And I'm sure within the armed forces, it would be seen as that, or would have been seen as that. Now people would come forward and be more open about it. Myself and my team at SCOAF, when I was Ombudsman, every single one of us did a mental health first aid course that was run by the armed forces. And I thought I knew a lot, and I learned a great deal more with that. So yes, I think it's really, really good. People shouldn't feel shame attached to any sort of mental health crisis, not at all.
Yes, or even be in denial. Journalism the same, I think. Our next question is from Tim Jones. Are you there, Tim? Unmute.
I think I'll write a book called You're on Mute.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Nicola. Thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. Just a very quick question from me. Do you feel...
There we go. Hi, Tim.
There we go. I'm just starting my video now. Sorry about that. Just in relation to what you were saying, do you feel that the introduction of a technology such as Say-So or Working Confidence would be supportive, where people are able to provide anonymized complaints and feedback? And do you think such a technology could improve the general cultural receptiveness to a complaint for a consideration and more of a culture of continual improvement?
Well, that's quite a packed question, which I'm going to try and unpack, actually. But I don't know, being perfectly honest, I don't know about those particular technologies that you're talking about. But in terms of the general question about anonymity, this is something that has come up in every ombudsman job I have done, actually. In fact, more so in my previous role as the Cayman Islands Complaints Commissioner, the ombudsman for the island there, because it was small and everybody was terrified about people finding out that they'd made a complaint. So I think with regards to the armed forces, I suppose on the one hand, you could say it would be a good thing because it would encourage more people to make a complaint. But on the other hand, the principles of good public administration say that you should know, and also the principles of natural justice, say that you as the person who is complained against, you are entitled to know who's made the complaint against you. So I think those two matters would always be balanced. And I think probably may well come down on the side of not for complaints. And if someone wanted to make an anonymous complaint, they could do it by way of being a whistleblower. Now, another thing, which I'm glad you asked this question, and going back to Baroness Jolly's, if I had extra time, what would I want? Probably to have the organization designated as a whistleblowing authority, because then someone could make an anonymous complaint. And we could look at that. Anyone that makes an anonymous complaint to my office right now, we can't look at it. They have to put their name to it. And that does put people off. Yeah. And I can understand why, but at the same time, the person against whom you're making a complaint has the right to know who is their accuser. So.
Dicey one. Our next questioner is Emma Norton. Are you there, Emma?
I am. I'm going to keep my video off because my bandwidth isn't wide enough. Can you hear me?
Hello,
okay?
Emma.
Hi, Nicola. Thanks very much for this. The question I wanted to ask you was, it's about the Armed Forces Bill, and it proposes to reduce the appeal rights of complainants by reducing the time limit for appealing their service complaint from 6 weeks to 2 weeks. And it's also going to enable the decision maker to set out the grounds on which their own decision can be appealed. And I take your point about the complaint system will always have vexatious complainants in it, and you've got to find ways of weeding those out and dealing with them. But the kinds of complaints I'm seeing are supporting victims of sexual harassment and victimization. And for those kinds of complainants, this is a terrible and very unfair proposal. And I wondered if you had a view about it.
Well, all I can say is that if I were in post and I was trying to think of a tactful way of putting this, but there is no tactful way of putting it. I disagree with that. It's not within my gift. I had, with regards to certain changes that were being made as to service complaints, there were changes that were proposed that I fundamentally disagreed with. There were other changes that were proposed that I thought were really good. This would fall into the ones that I disagree with, because I know that the idea is to speed up the process, but in actual fact, the delay is not usually with the person making the complaint, which may or may not actually go against the argument that I'm making. But if you want to improve delay, the delay doesn't come at that point. The delay comes at how the matter is progressed. That's where the delay is. So if the idea behind it, or the idea given, is because they want to streamline the process and reduce delay, that's not where the delay has been. Certainly not in my experience. So I don't know whether that helps. But... Hello?
Thanks, Em. I'm sure it does. Xander McLeish, you're our next interlocutor. Are you there?
Hi, so can you hear me okay?
Yes, very loud and clear. Thanks, Xander. Go ahead.
Right, so my question is, so with the topic being about culture change, and reluctance in some areas, I'm a logistics officer submariner, so I've just been away for 240 days in isolation.
That's a tough job to do, to be a submariner. I don't underestimate it, because I'm very claustrophobic, so I know. I've been to Faslane and I went into a submarine and I wasn't there very long. So yes, when it was in dry dock, so yeah.
So when you're completely away for months and months and months on end, I found towards the end of the cycle, that's when people started to want to make complaints. You know, whether it be 4 months ago or 5 months ago, because of the environment you're in, they felt that it was not the right time, or you're kind of stuck in this tin under the water. But what would you say to individuals that want to make subtle changes? We get the sentence, this is how it's always been done. Just to let the culture to adapt to the new generations coming through. So the question is more of, how do we actually incorporate the culture change and make those subtle amendments to not have to deal with something that might be still slightly back in the early noughties, if that makes sense?
Well, yeah, it does. But I can only talk about cultural change within the prism of service complaints, because, and I know it's much, much bigger than that, but with regards to service complaints, I think fundamentally people have to be reassured that if they have a matter about which they want to make a complaint, either a formal complaint to my office, a formal complaint within the service, or an informal complaint, which could be dealt with by way of informal resolution or mediation, that it is absolutely, as long as it's legitimate, you can make a complaint. That's the one thing that I want to see happen. I think in terms of a submariner's life, I can imagine after you've been underwater for literally hundreds of days in if you like, a long, thin tube, everybody's going to get on your nerves. It could be the nicest person, but they really will. And I think you must have Zen-like levels of calm to be able to do that. I think it's just making people feel that if they want to make a complaint, they can. And quite often, when people feel that, they actually don't do it. We've had many people contact our office and they just want to get something off their chest. And once they've done that, they said, well, actually, I feel better and I'm going to go away and think about it. And quite often they don't come back, because that release and that sense of being heard and believed is often all that someone wants. So I don't know if that's answered your question. Like I said, I can only talk about cultural change from within with authority from within my prison.
Thank you. Thank you for your question, Xander, and hats off to you for the job you're doing, and thank you for your service. And thank you to everybody who has tuned in this evening. We've still got a lot of questions, but we've run out of time, I'm afraid. So it remains for me to say thank you so much, Nicola. It's been a superb session. I've loved every minute of it. The questions have been fantastic. Once more, a plug for your book, Without Prejudice, out now. And I'm going to hand over to Dennis Martin, who is going to give the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairs, fellow members and esteemed guests, on behalf of the National Liberal Club, I'm very happy to thank Nicola Williams for being with us tonight and for a brilliant and fascinating talk about the culture and complaint system of the armed forces, and of course for answering all of our questions. I find it quite surprising to hear that independent civilian oversight really only started in 2008, and interesting how you developed the office. And I was glad to hear that complaints about bullying and harassment went down, that the attitude of senior leaders has changed over the years. And I was also really impressed to hear that mental health gets the attention it deserves, both in the army in general, but also, as you mentioned, I think initially, in the case of the workers in the office and the caseworkers in the office of the Ombudsman. And thank you for also sharing your thoughts on the challenges, staffing, complaints taking too long to resolve. 10 years is just shocking. And it does sound that things have really improved, but a lot remains to be done. And I'm really curious to see how this develops. Thank you again, Nicola, for being with us tonight, and I hope we will see you in the club sometime soon, end of lockdown permitting. And for everyone else, a quick reminder, you'll be able to pick up a recording of this talk on our YouTube channel, and do join us for the next event on the 10th of March on the surveillance state. It's a combined event with the Women's Circle for International Women's Day, and we'll be joined by 4 women with outstanding backgrounds in privacy and data who will discuss surveillance, technology, and all its challenges. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Noel, for arranging, and I hope I'll see you on the 10th of March.
Thank you. It's been a real honor for me to do this. Thank you. And thank you, Lynne.
Yes, thank you, indeed.